There is a certain kind of power that loves a costume. It loves velvet and gold and polished floors and ancient music echoing through stone halls. It loves a crown placed under bright lights. It loves a balcony wave timed to the second. It loves horses, carriages, uniforms, medals, and all the other glittering props that make ordinary people stop what they are doing and stare. And fair enough, it is a very expensive show. But the thing about old institutions, especially royal ones, is that the show is almost never where the real story lives. The real story lives in small rooms, in private studies, in hallways after midnight, in conversations spoken so softly that history has to reconstruct them later from fragments, glances, and the strange silence that follows. And in this story, that silence begins at 3:00 in the morning. Not with church bells, not with trumpets, not with a grand announcement rolling across television screens. Just a door closing, a pen uncapped, a document placed on a desk, and an old king, very tired, very aware, very much still king in title, signing a paper that would change the balance of power inside the palace without the public even realizing it had happened. That is where we begin. And trust me, royal watchers, scandal watchers, late-night comment section detectives, tea-spillers of the internet, this one has everything. Family loyalty, midnight paperwork, quiet betrayal, a future queen with nerves of steel, a queen consort who refuses to be managed, an heir who has decided that sentiment is a luxury the institution can no longer afford. Basically, if palace intrigue were a sport, this would be the championship final. So settle in. And while you are here, subscribe if this is your kind of story, because this is exactly the sort of royal drama that makes people say, no, I'm not obsessed, I'm just interested in the constitutional implications, while absolutely refreshing for updates every 7 minutes. No, the public still sees the old order. That is important. Outside the palace gates, nothing appears broken. The king's portrait is still official. His name is still spoken first. His position is still intact. The ceremonies continue. The schedules remain polished. Cars arrive, doors open, smiles are worn, hands are shaken. The machinery of monarchy, that great polished engine of symbolism, keeps moving as if nothing underneath it has shifted. But underneath, everything has shifted. Because the truth is this: a throne can remain occupied while power quietly changes hands elsewhere. And that is the part most people miss. They imagine power as a chair. Whoever sits in it must control it. But power inside a palace is not a chair. It is access. It is signatures. It is briefings. It is who gets the last word when a scandal breaks at 1:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. It is who decides what gets denied, who gets cut off, who gets protected, who gets frozen out, who gets the public smile, and who gets the locked door. That kind of power does not always arrive with a crown. Sometimes it arrives with a folder. And in our story, it did. Hours before dawn, the heir entered the king's private study carrying a leather-bound case. Not dramatic in the theatrical sense. No storm outside, no lightning, no orchestral boom. Honestly, the scariest moments are often the quietest. When nobody is shouting, nobody is performing, and everyone in the room understands that whatever is about to happen cannot be undone. He did not come to ask for more responsibility. He came to place evidence on the desk. And this is where things start to twist. Because the pressure on the crown had already been building for months, a widening scandal, old associations resurfacing, financial shadows, social ties that should have been severed long ago but somehow kept breathing in the dark. The kind of mess institutions always tell themselves they can manage right up until management turns into panic. The king had been trying to hold the line. Not because he was foolish, not because he did not understand the danger, but because age teaches a certain kind of instinct. Delay, absorb, steady the ship, keep the family together if at all possible, protect the institution by preventing open civil war inside it. That strategy works, until it doesn't. And what the heir brought into that room was not a theory. It was not a concern. It was not one of those vague palace briefings where everyone speaks in careful phrases and no one says the fatal sentence out loud. It was proof that someone at the center of the royal household had continued private contact with people tied to the most toxic orbit around the family's existing crisis. Not a rumor, not perhaps, not maybe there was tea. Actual contact, meetings, messages, movement kept outside the official record. You know, the kind of thing that makes every palace private secretary suddenly age 10 years in one afternoon. And here is the part that really matters. The person linked to those quiet contacts was not a distant cousin nobody sees except at Christmas and funerals. It was not some decorative aristocrat wandering around the edges of royal life in a hat the size of a satellite dish. It was the queen consort, the king's wife, the woman who had for years shaped access, timing, atmosphere, and influence around the sovereign himself. That is not a side issue. That is the issue. Because once the person beside the king becomes the variable, the whole system begins to shake. Now, before anybody runs away with the simplest version of this story, let's slow down, because the simplest version is rarely the truest one. This was not just about scandal. It was about loyalty. And loyalty is where royal stories get dangerous, because loyalty sounds noble until two loyalties collide, and only one can survive. The queen consort in this story was not maintaining these contacts because she was naive. She was not some clueless woman wandering into danger by accident like she had taken the wrong turn at a garden party. No, her position was much more human than that, which is what made it so explosive. She believed in personal loyalty over institutional panic. She had old friendships, old histories, old attachments that predated titles, predated crowns, predated public strategy. In her mind, to sever a relationship the second it became inconvenient was not strength. It was cowardice. It was betrayal dressed up as prudence. And I know some of you already know exactly where you stand on that. Some of you are going, yes, finally, a person with a spine. Someone refusing to treat human beings like disposable furniture just because the palace PR team is sweating. Others are sitting there thinking, absolutely not. This is Monarchy, not a reunion tour. You do not get to endanger the institution because you are sentimental about your old circle. And honestly, that split right there is the whole heart of this drama. Because the heir saw the same situation through a completely different lens. To him, old ties were not noble, they were vulnerabilities. Every private contact was a possible leak point. Every off-calendar conversation was a future headline waiting to happen. Every act of personal loyalty to compromised people was, in effect, a small knife held against the throat of the institution. And he was done pretending otherwise. That is what he placed before his father in the early hours of the morning, not just proof of contact, but proof that the old model of governance inside the palace had failed, that the soft handling, the quiet accommodations, the careful, let us not make this worse, approach had reached its limit. At some point, every royal household faces the same nightmare question. Who do you save? The person or the crown? And what makes this story so brutal is that by the time those papers hit the desk, the answer had already narrowed to almost nothing. According to those who later tried to piece together that night, the king looked at the papers for less than a minute. Less than a minute. Think about that. Years of marriage. Years of trust. Years of carefully maintained balance inside the palace. And then 1 minute. 1 minute in which an old man, still king, still sovereign, still carrying all the ritual dignity of the office, had to decide whether his closest ally had become the very risk he could no longer carry. That is the sort of choice history books flatten into one sentence, but in real life it must feel like being split in half. And in the end, he signed. Not an abdication, not a surrender, something much stranger than that. A controlled transfer, a private restructuring, a silent coronation without a crown ever changing heads. The heir did not become king. He became something almost more unsettling. The man with final say. The one who could veto, freeze, redirect, isolate, authorize, deny. Not the face of the monarchy, the nerve center. And let me tell you something, that kind of power is always more frightening than public ceremony, because public ceremony has to smile, it has to wave, it has to be seen. Shadow power does not. Shadow power just works. By breakfast, the architecture of the household had been rebuilt. The king remained visible. The heir became decisive. And the queen consort, though not yet publicly diminished, had already lost the ground beneath her feet. But if you think the story ends there, with one signature and one quiet power shift, oh no, not even close. Because morning came. And morning, as it often does in these stories, brought not peace but retaliation. The queen consort woke to find that the world had changed shape around her without her consent. She had not been consulted. She had not been invited into the decision. She had not even been allowed the dignity of arguing before the structure was altered. That kind of exclusion does something to a person, especially a person who has spent years mastering the palace from the inside. She understood instantly what had happened. Not every detail, maybe, but enough. Enough to know that authority had moved. Enough to know that she had been bypassed. Enough to know that the heir was no longer merely waiting. He was ruling. And when a veteran palace operator realizes she has been outmaneuvered, she does not necessarily cry in the corridor. Sometimes she leaks. Sometimes she counters. Sometimes she reaches for the one narrative that might still blow the whole thing open. So by late morning, whispers began to move. Not official statements, those come later, dressed and powdered. No, these were sharper than that, personal, strategic, a line of attack aimed not directly at the heir, but at his wife. And this is where the future queen enters fully into the frame. For years, the public has seen her as Grace under pressure. Calm, polished, warm, measured. The kind of royal figure who makes difficulty look almost effortless, which, let's be honest, is its own kind of terrifying skill. There are people who cannot answer a text without sounding weird. She can stand in front of a nation and make composure look casual. But in the private version of this story, she is more than composed. She is strategic. And not in a loud way, not in a cartoon villain, chessboard in a candle latroom way, more dangerous than that, quietly prepared, legally briefed, financially alert, 3 steps ahead while appearing merely supportive. The leaks accused her of orchestrating the shift, of nudging the king toward dependence, of helping her husband move early, of turning illness, crisis, and scandal into an opportunity for generational takeover. Heavy accusation. And clever, too. Because it aimed straight for public sympathy, the image of a vulnerable king, the suspicion of a younger pair moving too soon, the fear that behind every soft smile sits cold ambition. It could have worked. In another family. On another day. With another woman. But then came the tea-room meeting. And I need you to picture this properly, because the atmosphere matters. Clarence House, late morning, fine china probably involved, because of course it was, a room designed for civility, the kind of room where even the curtains seem to have opinions about etiquette. And into that room walked two women who, until then, had maintained the palace version of peace. Not friendship, exactly, not warmth in the ordinary sense, but functionality, coexistence, controlled grace. That morning, the mask had cracked. The queen consort arrived furious, but not wild. That is an important difference. Wild anger can be dismissed. Controlled fury is much more dangerous. It thinks, it chooses, it lands its words where they will bruise the longest. The future queen arrived steady. Not icy, not theatrical, steady. And that steadiness is what unsettled everyone present. Because when people have something to fear, they tend to fidget. They over-explain. They rush to smooth tension. They perform innocence so hard it practically glows. She did none of that. She sat. She listened. She let the storm come to her. And then the queen consort fired the shot. Not think piece language, not palace wording, something more direct. A line accusing the younger woman of playing rescuer while reaching for power before the king's place had even cooled. In other words, do not pretend this is duty when it is ambition. Move. That is not tea-room tension. That is dynastic warfare in pearls. And for a few seconds, the room went still in the worst possible way. Then the door opened. The heir entered. And with him came that same black folder energy again, which by this point was basically the most feared object in the monarchy. He did not walk in like a husband rushing to defend his wife. He walked in like a man concluding a process. That is colder. Much colder. He placed the folder on the table. Inside were photographs. Recent. Clear. Undeniable. The queen consort meeting in private with the very figure whose continued proximity the heir had declared intolerable to the institution's survival strategy. No wiggle room. No, this can be misunderstood. No comforting fog. Just evidence. And with the photos came something worse than anger. Terms. That is when you know the battle is over, not when people yell, when one side starts offering terms. Accept withdrawal from strategic decision-making. Retain the title. Retain the ceremonial position. Retain the appearance of continuity. But lose the machinery. Lose the gatekeeping. Lose the budget influence. Lose the personnel sway. Lose the invisible network of power that had made the role truly matter. And if not, exposure, public ruin, total detonation. Now pause there, because this is the moral cliff edge of the whole story. Was he protecting the institution? Or was he running an internal intelligence operation against his own family? Some of you will say necessary. Some of you will say monstrous. Most of you, if you are honest, will say both. And that is why this story hits so hard, especially for audiences in the UK, the US, and everywhere else. People watch Monarchy like it is part history, part theatre, part slow-motion family collapse with better tailoring. Because beneath all the tradition sits a question modern people understand very well. How much ruthlessness is acceptable when you are trying to save a system that may no longer know how to save itself? That question does not go away with a tiara. If anything, it gets sharper. And now we need to talk about the future queen properly, because she is not just standing beside the heir in this story. She is helping build the framework that makes his rule possible. While the queen consort defended old loyalties, the younger woman had reportedly spent weeks doing something less visible and, frankly, more lethal in institutional terms. She had been building the firewall. Legal, financial, procedural. She understood something crucial. If the transfer of real authority happened messily, it could be challenged, undermined, delayed, mocked, torn apart by competing advisors and hostile narratives, and the thousand little knives of elite resistance. So she made sure it could not be easily undone. Every question reviewed, every line tightened, every funding pathway separated, every possible contamination point examined. She was not thinking in emotional terms, she was thinking generationally. And here is where the story becomes bigger than one king, one heir, one angry queen consort, one folder, one tea-room standoff. Because the younger woman was not acting only for her husband. She was acting for the child who comes after him, for the next generation, for the future monarch who will one day inherit not just jewels and estates and ceremonies, but the full rotten miracle of the institution itself. That changes everything. Once you start thinking like that, sentiment becomes expensive. Dangerously expensive. An old friendship is no longer just an old friendship. It is a risk transfer into the future. A private favor is no longer a private favor. It is a leak in the hull of a ship your children are meant to sail. And suddenly the colder choice starts to look, at least from inside that mindset, like the kinder one in the long run. Do you see why people get obsessed with this stuff? It is never only gossip. It is values fighting in expensive rooms. It is family language used to mask constitutional struggle. It is love, loyalty, fear, image, legacy, inheritance, survival. With better wallpaper. By afternoon, the consequences began to settle. The queen consort was not publicly humiliated. The palace is too disciplined for that. It understands the value of soft surfaces even when hard decisions are being made underneath. So the language was gentle. Consultative role. Temporary withdrawal. A period of private reflection. You know the sort of phrases institutions invent when they need to describe exile in silk gloves. But everyone inside knew what it meant. She had been sidelined, not erased, not divorced from the image, not stripped in public. That would be too messy. No, this was cleaner and therefore crueler. She would still appear, still smile, still stand where required. But the flow of power would move around her now, not through her. And for someone used to shaping the king's environment, that is not a minor change, that is a kind of vanishing. At the same time, the heir's structure was already taking form. Fewer people involved, fewer layers, tighter controls, clearer lines. A monarchy run less like a sprawling family and more like a disciplined core operation. Some of you will hear that and think finally. Others will hear it and think how bleak. And again, both reactions make sense. Because the old royal model survives on ambiguity, on blurred lines, on the weird emotional bargain people make with monarchy, we know it is archaic, we know it is theatrical, we know it is unequal, and yet many people tolerate it, even love it, because it still feels human, messy, familiar, full of difficult relatives and flawed personalities and soft edges and private mercy. Strip too much of that away, and what are you left with? A machine in a palace. Efficient, yes. Clean, maybe. But emotionally thinner. And perhaps easier in the long run to question. That is the gamble the heir is making. That the public no longer wants a complicated family managing a symbolic state role. That the public wants standards, boundaries, visible discipline. No more indulgence for scandal wrapped in old titles. No more emotional exemptions. No more, well, he's family. If that is the mood of the age, then he may be exactly right. But there is risk in becoming too controlled, too sharp, too transparent in some ways and too ruthless in others. Because once you teach people to evaluate monarchy by modern standards, efficiency, ethics, accountability, clean governance, they may eventually ask a very awkward next question. Why do we need monarchy at all? That right there is the paradox. To save the institution, he may have to modernize it. To modernize it, he may strip away the very haze that has protected it for centuries. And once the haze is gone, once the mystery thins, once the family becomes a system and the system becomes measurable, monarchy steps onto ground where old magic does not help nearly as much. Now imagine the king in all of this. Still present, still visible, still treated with formal reverence. And yet, in the private rooms, the decisive energy has moved elsewhere. What must that feel like? Relief, perhaps. Grief, certainly. Maybe gratitude. Maybe humiliation. Maybe all of it at once. A father seeing his son become the hard thing the age demands. A sovereign still sovereign, yet no longer the final mover in the moments that matter most. That is not a simple tragedy. It is something stranger. A living handover without full surrender. A reign within a reign. A shadow crown. And maybe that is why this kind of story lingers, because it speaks to something beyond royalty. Egging power. Succession before death. The younger generation stepping in not with celebration, but with clipped voices and legal folders and the exhausting logic of crisis. Plenty of families understand that feeling, even without palaces. The moment when the older figure is still there, still loved, still central, but cannot quite carry the full burden anymore. And someone else has to step forward, and nobody knows whether to call it duty, ambition, or betrayal. Usually it is all three. That is what makes it hurt. And as night falls on the first day of this new arrangement, one fact hangs over everything else. The danger is not gone. The Queen Consort's sidelining does not erase the network that caused the panic in the first place. The contacts still exist. The documents still exist. The old loyalties still exist. The wider scandal still breathes. Which means the heir has not solved the problem. He has taken ownership of it. Very different thing. And ownership is where the real test begins. Because anyone can make a dramatic move. Anyone can slam a folder down and redraw a hierarchy and look wonderfully decisive, while everybody else is still blinking. The hard part comes after. Can he contain the fallout? Can he keep the king stable and publicly credible while privately steering the machine himself? Can he manage the Queen Consort's resentment without provoking open fracture? Can the future queen keep building that immaculate legal and financial architecture without looking, to the public, like a woman who has replaced warmth with strategy? Can the crown be hardened without becoming hollow? Those are not tiny questions. Those are century questions. And that is why I think royal watchers around the world get pulled into stories like this, whether they are in London, Lagos, New York, Sydney, Toronto, Nairobi, or somewhere quietly watching on a phone under a blanket when they should have been asleep an hour ago. Because monarchy is never only about one family. It is about what a country thinks continuity should look like. It is about whether symbolism can survive modern scrutiny. It is about whether heritage still has force in an age that mistrusts inherited power. And it is about something deeply human too. What people do when love, loyalty, and survival point in different directions. So now the palace enters a new phase. Publicly, continuity. Privately, command has shifted. The king remains the face. The heir becomes the final filter. The future queen becomes the architect no one is supposed to notice too closely. And the queen consort, still present, still titled, becomes the living reminder that in old institutions, the most dangerous defeats are often the silent ones. No crowds, No announcement, no dramatic march out the gates. Just fewer calls answered, fewer doors opened, fewer decisions routed your way. Until one day you realize you are still inside the frame, but no longer shaping the picture. That is a brutal kind of defeat. And yet, even now, there is room for one more twist. Because in stories like this, the person everyone thinks has been neutralized is often the one still holding an unseen match. Old friendships can be liabilities. They can also be archives. Memories, letters, financial traces, quiet knowledge of how things used to work before the younger generation started pretending that hard resets can erase history. And if that history pushes back, if more surfaces, if more names, numbers, arrangements, understandings drift into the light, then the heir may discover something nasty. Transparency is easiest to demand right up until it starts cutting through your own side of the glass. And yes, that is the danger of building a palace out of clean lines. Glass looks beautiful. Glass also shatters. So where does that leave us tonight? With a king still wearing the crown. With an heir already exercising the weight of it in all but name. With a future queen proving that velvet can hide steel. With a queen consort discovering that old loyalty can become political doom when the age has lost patience for softness. With a royal household trying to look serene while privately re-engineering itself in real time. And with the rest of us, let's be honest, watching in that very specific way royal watchers watch, half horrified, half fascinated, fully aware that if this were fiction people would say it was overwritten, yet somehow palace reality always finds a way to be even stranger. That is why these stories endure. Not because crowns are shiny, though yes, that too, but because behind every public ritual sits a private argument about power, who deserves it, who can wield it, who has lost the right, who gets protected, who gets sacrificed, who gets remembered as noble, and who gets quietly rewritten as the risk that had to be managed. This story is not really about one morning. It is about the future, about whether a monarchy can cut itself down to survive and still remain recognizably alive. About whether modern discipline can replace ancient ambiguity. About whether the public wants a cleaner crown or simply a different country. And about whether the people now steering the institution understand that control, once seized, comes with a bill that always arrives later. So yes, the shadow reign has begun. Not with fireworks, not with cheering crowds, not even with a throne changing hands. Just with paper, evidence, silence, and a family discovering that sometimes the most important coronation is the one nobody is meant to see. Tell me where you land on this, because honestly there is no way to watch a story like this and stay neutral for long. Are you with the heir who thinks survival requires ruthless clarity? Are you with the queen consort who believes loyalty means something even when it becomes inconvenient? Or are you staring at the future queen thinking, this is exactly the kind of calm that changes history while everyone else is still arguing about tone? Drop your take in the comments, because this is the kind of palace drama people will be dissecting for ages, and the best part is always hearing which moment made your jaw drop first. And if you enjoy royal breakdowns told like the thriller they secretly are, hit like, subscribe, and stay close, because stories like this never end where people think they will. They just slip behind another door, lower their voices, and wait for the next leak, the next meeting, the next impossible decision. And that, honestly, is why none of us can look away. Thank you for being here.